Imagine you've just spent, years writing the absolute ultimate theoretical blueprint for how society should run. Like, it's perfect, right?
Yeah, flawless logic.
Exactly. The logic flows flawlessly. The historical stages are all mapped out in pristine detail, and you've built this philosophical engine that you're just totally convinced explains the entire trajectory of human history. And then suddenly you look out the window and
Half of Europe is literally on fire.
literally on fire. Governments are collapsing. Kings are fleeing. You essentially have to, put the pen down, step right over the barricades, and actually lead a revolution in real time. And that is exactly what happened to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in 1848.
It is honestly the ultimate collision of abstract theory and messy, totally unpredictable reality. You go from the quiet of the reading room directly into the crossfire of, street fighting, mass protests, and just chaotic political maneuvering.
Yeah, which is wild.
Yeah.
So welcome to this deep dive. Our mission today is to explore a truly pivotal moment in political history by unpacking Volume 7 of the Marx and Engels collected works.
Right, which covers those incredibly explosive months from
Yeah.
March to November 1848.
Yeah. And we are going to examine how two of history's most famous political philosophers transitioned from, writing those abstract theories into becoming on-the-ground revolutionary strategists and, gritty daily journalists. We'll look at their specific demands, the massive daily newspaper they ran, and how they reacted to the sheer chaos of a continent just undergoing massive upheaval.
And if we're going to understand that transition, we really have to look at the sheer chaos of the environment they were stepping into. Because before 1848, they were primarily building the general theoretical basis of their philosophy.
Think like dialectical materialism.
Exactly, which is the idea that history is driven by material and economic conflicts rather than just abstract ideas. But Volume 7 captures the exact moment they had to apply those economic theories to a rapidly and drastically changing physical situation.
Right. And if you're listening to this and wondering, why on earth you should care about 1848 Germany, it's because it's an absolute masterclass in adaptation. It shows what happens when intellectuals are forced to adapt to their theories on the fly amidst rapid social change. It provides an incredible lens for understanding political strategy, media influence, and grassroots organization, even today.
Oh, absolutely.
But real quick, before we jump into the timeline, I want to make something very clear. While we are exploring the foundational texts of Marxism and communism during the 1848 revolutions, we are doing so as an impartial historical deep dive.
Yeah, that's crucial to point out.
Right. We are not taking sides. We are not endorsing any of the viewpoints contained in these texts, whether left-wing or right-wing. We're simply trying to impartially report on the content provided and neutrally unpack the fascinating ideas, strategies, and historical mechanics contained strictly within the original source material.
Yeah, the focus here is strictly analytical. We're looking at the how and the whys of their historical actions based on the sources we have. It's really an anatomical breakdown of a political strategy during a crisis.
Okay, so set the stage for us. When we talk about Germany in early 1848, we aren't talking about the unified nation we see on a map today, right? What are Marx and Engels actually walking into?
They are walking into a complete geopolitical jigsaw puzzle. Germany in 1848 was not a single unified country. The sources tell us that the German-speaking lands were fragmented into some 36 large and small states known loosely as the German Confederation.
Wow. 36.
Yeah, it was an organizational nightmare. You had two major rival powers, the Kingdom of Prussia and the Austrian Empire, and then this chaotic mix of smaller kingdoms like Bavaria, principalities, grand duchies, church lands, free cities.
It sounds like a total bureaucratic labyrinth. I mean, if you're trying to organize a massive unified political movement, how do you even start when you have to, cross a border, change your currency, and deal with a completely different set of censorship laws every 50 miles?
You've hit on the exact problem. Germany was plagued by the remnants of medieval particularism and local isolation. Each of these states fiercely guarded its own local power.
Right.
While they did have a customs union, the Zollverein, which helped integrate their economies a little bit politically and legally, it was just a motley conglomeration of feudal absolutism. Kings and princes ruled by divine right, and civil liberties were virtually non-existent in a lot of areas.
And for Marx and Engels, who have been sitting in exile in places like Brussels and Paris working out their theories, 1848 happens. The February Revolution in France overthrows the French monarchy, and the spark just jumps across the border. Suddenly there are uprisings in Berlin, in Vienna, all across these fragmented German states. How do they react to the revolution they've been waiting for actually, kicking off?
Well, immediately, they faced this massive strategic disagreement with other radical factions about how to handle the outbreak. The class forces were shifting rapidly, the masses were engaging in spontaneous actions. For their burgeoning movement, this was the real testing time for its party doctrines.
So it's like, do you try to force the revolution from the outside or do you work from within?
Exactly.
Let's talk about the faction that wanted to force it from the outside, because there's a specific incident in the sources that really highlights this clash of strategies. The sources mention these petty bourgeois emigrant leaders living in Paris, specifically guys named Georg Herva and Adalbert von Bornstedt.
Right, the Volunteer Legion.
Yeah, they were German radicals living in exile, and their idea for bringing the revolution to Germany was basically to mount a physical invasion.
Yes, so Hervo was a romantic poet, actually, and he and Bornstedt hatched this plan to speed up the German Revolution by literally exporting it at the point of a bayonet. They wanted to take an armed volunteer legion made up of German craftsmen and political exiles living in Paris and march them across the Rhine River into German territory to proclaim a republic.
Because march right in.
Yeah, and the kicker is they were funding this expedition with private donations and subsidies from the brand new French provisional government.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I read this and I immediately thought of a modern analogy. It's like a naive tech startup that has just secured a massive round of venture capital funding, in this case, the French provisional government's money.
Right, the VC money.
Right. And they decide they are going to aggressively force their new product into a market that just isn't ready for it yet. They just want to blast their way in with a massive, expensive, flashy launch, completely ignoring all the local conditions on the ground.
The tech startup analogy works on one level, but to truly understand the mechanics of this, we have to look at the cynical political maneuvering behind that quote-unquote venture capital.
Yeah.
Like, why was the French provisional government giving weapons and money to radical German exiles?
Yeah, why?
It wasn't out of pan-European solidarity. The French moderates, people like Lamartine, were terrified of the radical armed workers in their own capital. By funding Hervé's Legion, the French government was effectively paying to export its own radical problem out of Paris.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they were giving these German revolutionaries a one-way ticket to go get themselves killed somewhere else.
Wait, really? So the French are basically saying, here are some muskets, please leave our city and go bother the King of Prussia.
Pretty much.
That is incredibly cynical. And Marx and Engels are watching this unfold. What is their reaction to Hervé's plan?
They view it as romantic adventurism of the worst kind. Marx and Engels staunchly oppose this scheme. From a purely military and strategic standpoint, they realized that taking a few thousand poorly trained volunteer craftsmen and marching them into Germany would basically just deliver them, completely defenseless, straight into the hands of the highly disciplined, heavily armed regular troops of Prussia and the other German states.
Right, just suicide.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But beyond the military disaster, they saw it as politically destructive. They argued that trying to impose a revolution from the outside through an invasion would actually undermine the organic ferment happening on the ground.
Because it looks like an invasion.
Right. It would allow the German kings to rally the population around national defense against a foreign incursion, thereby strengthening the existing governments.
That makes perfect sense. If you invade, you instantly turn the local population against you because nobody likes an invading army, even if they are carrying a banner of freedom. So what was the alternative? If Marx and Engels are rejecting this romantic, flashy invasion, what are they actually telling their followers, the members of the Communist League, to do?
They urged the German workers who were living in exile to return home individually. They wanted them to cross the border quietly, singly, and infiltrate back into their home regions to join the revolutionary battles that were already naturally brewing in their local areas.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it was all about integrating into the existing mass struggle rather than trying to impose something artificially from the outside.
Right. They wanted their people inside the system, working with the existing momentum of the local crowds, participating in the democratic clubs and the workers' associations that were springing up organically.
And that grounded, practical approach leads us perfectly into the actual program they brought with them. Because once these exiles infiltrated back into Germany, they needed a unified set of goals. They needed a concrete political objective.
Which brings us to a fascinating document detailed in Volume 7, The Demands of the Communist Party in Germany. This was drafted in Paris in March 1848 by Marx, Engels, and other members of the Central Authority of the Communist League. And this wasn't just like a philosophical text kept in a desk drawer.
No, not at all.
It was printed as a leaflet in Cologne and published in several Democratic newspapers in April. It was meant to be handed out on street corners. Let's break down some of these specific demands, because if you're expecting a manifesto calling for the immediate abolition of all money and the establishment of a futuristic utopia, you're going to be very surprised by what they actually asked for.
The very first demand sets the tone perfectly. Demand number 1 states, the whole of Germany shall be declared a single and indivisible republic.
Which goes right back to the jigsaw puzzle we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
They are looking at the 30-plus fragmented states and saying, we have to smash this. But wait, there were other democratic factions at the time who also wanted a united Germany, but they advocated for a federal model, right? Something like Switzerland or the United States, where local states kept a lot of their own autonomy. Why were Marx and Engels so opposed to federalism? Why the insistence on a single and indivisible centralized republic?
Well, because they believe that local autonomy in the context of 1848 Germany would simply preserve the power of the local reactionary elites.
The local kings and princes.
Exactly. The petty princes, the local nobles, the regional bureaucrats. If you have a federal system, a conservative state like Bavaria could just ignore progressive legislation passed at the national level. For Marx and Engels, the first condition for any serious social progress was to completely eradicate that medieval dismemberment. They saw centralization on a democratic basis as the absolute necessary precondition to unify the working class. You can't have a unified national labor movement if the country itself isn't unified politically and legally.
Okay, so they are demanding a massive centralized state apparatus. Then we get to demands 2 and 3, which focus on the mechanics of voting and representation. They demanded universal suffrage for every German over the age of 21, provided they hadn't been convicted of a criminal offense. But here is the kicker, and this really stood out to me when reading the sources. They explicitly demanded that representatives of the people should receive payment.
Yeah, it seems like such a minor administrative detail, doesn't it? But to understand why this was revolutionary, you have to look at the structural barriers of the time. In the 19th century, serving in a parliament or a legislative assembly was often unpaid, or the property qualifications to even run for office were incredibly high.
Right. If you aren't paying politicians a salary, the only people who can literally afford to take 6 months off work to go sit in a parliament building in Frankfurt or Berlin are the independently wealthy.
The landlords, the factory owners, the rich lawyers.
Precisely. By demanding that representatives be paid, they were creating the physical, economic mechanism that would actually allow working-class people, a carpenter, a weaver, a printer, to become members of the German parliament without starving their families. It was a mechanical fix to a systemic inequality. If you're listening to this and you've ever wondered why we pay elected officials today, this is exactly why. It was originally a radical democratic demand designed to disrupt wealthy elites from monopolizing the government. Okay, so we have a unified republic, universal voting, paid politicians. Let's look at demand for the universal arming of the people. But they didn't just want a citizen militia like the Second Amendment in the U.S. They added a really specific twist. They demanded that the troops should become labor armies that produce more than is necessary for their upkeep.
This is a fascinating glimpse into their economic thinking. In 1848, standing armies were massive drains on the national economy. You had hundreds of thousands of young men who consumed food, clothing, and weapons, but produced absolutely nothing in return. Marx and Engels wanted to turn the military into a productive economic force.
How would that even work?
Well, they imagined a citizen militia that would also engage in public works, infrastructure, or agriculture, ensuring that the state apparatus didn't become a parasitic drain on the working class.
That is a massive shift in how you view the function of a military. And speaking of the economy, the agrarian demands in this document are sweeping. They call for the abolition of all feudal obligations, like tithes and corvées. For those who might not be familiar with medieval agricultural terms, a corvée was basically unpaid forced labor. A peasant would have to spend a certain number of days a week working the local lord's land for free before they could tend to their own crops.
Yeah, it was the absolute bedrock of feudal exploitation. And crucially, Marx and Engels demanded that these feudal obligations be abolished without compensation to the nobility.
And that's the sticking point, right?
Oh, definitely.
Because the liberal politicians of the time often agreed that feudalism was outdated, but they thought the peasants should have to buy their freedom. They wanted the peasants to pay massive redemption fees to the lords to compensate them for the loss of that free labor. And Marx and Engels are saying, absolutely not. You do not pay the thief for the return of your stolen property.
It was a direct attack on the economic base of aristocratic rule. But they went even further. They demanded that all princely estates, along with mines and pits, become state property. And they specified that these confiscated estates should not be chopped up into tiny, inefficient plots for individual peasants.
Right.
Instead, they demanded they be cultivated on a large scale using the most up-to-date scientific devices in the interests of the whole of society. Furthermore, they demanded that mortgages on peasant lands be declared state property, and the interest on those mortgages be paid by the peasants to the state as a tax.
Okay, wait. I have to push back here. Because if I am a German peasant in 1848 and my family has been working a plot of land for generations under a feudal lord, my dream is to own that plot of land myself. I want my own farm. And here come these guys from Paris saying, no, we are going to confiscate the Lord's land and turn it into a massive, scientifically managed state farm, and by the way, your mortgage now belongs to the government. That sounds completely alien to a peasantry that just wants private property. Wouldn't that demand totally alienate the very peasants they are trying to recruit?
That is a brilliant observation, and you have highlighted one of the major historical tensions in Marxist theory. You're absolutely right. The immediate instinct of the peasantry was often to secure their own small private plots. But Marx and Engels were looking at the long-term economic trajectory.
So they were thinking steps ahead.
Yeah. They believed that chopping up the land into millions of tiny, inefficient subsistence farms would ultimately doom the peasants to poverty and make them prey to wealthy capitalist moneylenders. They argued that only large-scale, scientifically managed agriculture could generate enough surplus to lift society out of poverty. They were trying to leapfrog the stage of small-scale peasant ownership directly into socialized agriculture.
But stepping back and looking at this entire list of demands of republic, voting rights, paying politicians, nationalizing some specific lands, none of this sounds like the immediate implementation of full communism. Like, they aren't abolishing all private property overnight here. They aren't abolishing the wage system. Why is the Communist Party issuing demands that sound mostly like aggressive liberal democracy?
To explain that, we have to talk about a concept that becomes central to their strategy, the doctrine of permanent revolution. Think of a revolution like a multi-stage rocket.
Okay.
The rocket needs to reach orbit, right? That's the ultimate goal of a classless communist society. But it can't get there in one burst.
Okay, I'm following.
In 1848, Germany is still stuck on the Launchpad, weighed down by the heavy gravity of feudalism. Kings, nobles, serfdom. Germany hasn't even achieved what Marx calls a bourgeois democratic revolution, which is the kind of capitalist democratic system that countries like England or the United States were developing. The demands they issued were the booster engine. The goal of this first stage was to organize the workers and the peasants to push for a complete radical democratic republic, sweeping away all the survivals of feudalism.
So they have to build a modern capitalist democracy first, just to clear the board of the old medieval rules.
Yes. They saw a successful bourgeois democratic revolution as the absolutely necessary prologue. But, and this is where the permanent part comes in, they didn't intend to stop once the Democratic Republic was established. Once the first booster engine runs out of fuel and detaches, they wanted the working class to immediately fire the second engine.
The proletarian revolution.
Exactly, to push beyond capitalism and actually reach orbit. They were fighting for democracy, but doing so in a way that maximized the political power, the arming, and the organization of the working class for the next phase of the struggle.
That rocket metaphor really clarifies it. They are fighting alongside the liberal Democrats to overthrow the king, but with the full intention of moving past those same liberals the moment the king is gone. But here is the massive logistical problem. To coordinate this multi-stage rocket, to push these specific demands across a fragmented country, they needed a way to communicate. They couldn't just rely on leaflets handed out in taverns. They needed a megaphone.
Right.
Which brings us to the most fascinating operational part of Volume 7, the story of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung.
This is where their theoretical work truly transitions into gritty daily action. In April 1848, Marx and Engels moved to Cologne, which was the capital of the Rhine province.
Why Cologne? Why not Berlin or Vienna, where the major uprisings were happening?
Because the Rhineland was the most economically and politically advanced region in Germany. It was a major industrial hub, so it had a large developing working class. But equally important was its legal structure.
The laws were different.
Yeah. Because the Rhineland had been occupied by the French during the Napoleonic Wars, it still retained the Napoleonic Code. This meant it had a tradition of trial by jury and significantly more freedom of the press than the rest of authoritarian Prussia. It was the best possible staging ground for a media operation.
And what a media operation it was. They started a massive daily newspaper called the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, or the NRZ for short. But to understand the genius of their strategy here, we have to look at the numbers. The Communist League, the actual underground organization they were leading, only had about 200 or 300 members scattered across the entirety of Germany.
They were numerically microscopic. If they had tried to form a mass independent proletarian party overnight, it would have been entirely impracticable. They would have been an isolated sect shouting into the void.
So what did they do? They didn't call their paper the Communist Daily. The subtitle of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung was the organ of democracy. They entered the political scene entirely legally, positioning themselves as the extreme left wing of the broader democratic movement. It was essentially an infiltration strategy.
Yes, but we should be careful with the word infiltration because it implies they were hiding their views.
Her point.
They were actually very open about their specific perspectives in the paper, but they realized that secret, underground activity made no sense during an open, public revolution. They instructed their scattered league members to join existing workers' associations and local democratic societies. And the newspaper was the central instrument to direct and coordinate those members while simultaneously reaching a massive public audience of tens of thousands of readers.
I want to dig into the actual mechanics of how this newspaper ran because the sources give us a detailed look at the editorial board, and it's fascinating. It was a highly organized, relentless machine. Karl Marx was the editor-in-chief, holding dictatorial control over the editorial line. Engels was an editor. The editorials, which formulated the paper's main stance on the revolution, were usually marked with a single asterisk or a double asterisk, and the word Kun.
And they had a precise, grueling division of labor. Producing a daily paper in 1848 was a massive physical undertaking. Marx was often tied up with the administrative and organizational side of keeping the paper financially afloat, dealing with printers and fighting off constant police harassment and legal indictments.
So he was doing all the back-end stuff.
Yeah. Because Marx was so busy running the operation, Engels actually wrote a huge portion of the leading articles. Engels also handled military affairs, closely tracking the troop movements and uprisings in Italy and Hungary. And he wrote scathing critiques of the debates happening in the national assemblies.
But it wasn't just the two of them. They brought in a whole team of dedicated writers from the Communist League. Wilhelm Wolff handled all the agrarian questions, writing extensively about the condition of the peasants. Georg Werth, who Engels later called the first and most important poet of the German proletariat, wrote the feuilletons, the literary and cultural columns that ran at the bottom of the page. And they even had Ferdinand Freiligrath, a very famous poet at the time, publishing revolutionary poetry right there in the pages of the paper. It was a full-spectrum media operation combining hard news, political theory, and cultural critique.
It really was.
But wait, here is the mechanism I really want to understand. You mentioned Marx was dealing with keeping the paper financially afloat. If this paper is secretly pushing a long-term communist agenda and its goal is to eventually move past the liberal bourgeoisie, who was paying for the printing presses, weren't they relying on bourgeois shareholders to fund the paper?
They absolutely were. The initial capital for the Neue Rheinische Zeitung came from liberal, middle-class merchants and professionals in Cologne who supported the general democratic movement.
So how did Marx maintain editorial control when the people funding the paper must have hated his radical economic theories? I mean, if I am a wealthy merchant funding a newspaper and the editor starts demanding the confiscation of private property without compensation, I'm pulling my money immediately.
And that is exactly what happened. Almost immediately after the first few issues, the bourgeois shareholders started complaining bitterly about the paper's radical tone, especially after Marx and Engels vehemently defended the armed uprisings of workers in Paris. The shareholders threatened to withdraw their funding.
So what did Marx do?
Well, his mechanism for handling this was sheer editorial ruthlessness. He had structured the editorial board so that he had absolute final say. He essentially treated the shareholders merely as initial cash sources to buy the presses and establish circulation. Once the paper had a massive readership and it quickly became one of the most widely read papers in Germany, it could sustain itself on subscriptions and its sheer momentum. at least for a while.
Wow.
Yeah, Marx basically dared the shareholders to leave, refusing to compromise a single syllable of his political line to appease them.
That is incredible. He used their own money to build the platform and
Yeah.
then used the platform to attack their class interests.
Precisely.
And that brings us to the actual content of the paper. What were they writing about every single day? The sources lay out three major fronts. The NRZ fought on national unification, the agrarian question, and foreign policy. Let's start with unification. We know they wanted a single republic. But how did they cover the actual unification efforts happening around them?
They relentlessly fought for unification from below. At the time, there was a massive debate among German liberals about how to unite the country. Some wanted a Großdeutschland, a Greater Germany that included the Austrian Empire. Others wanted a Kleindeutschland, a lesser Germany, led by the Kingdom of Prussia. Marx and Engels ferociously attacked both of these plans.
Because if Prussia or Austria led the unification, it wouldn't be a democratic republic. It would just be the old aristocratic powers expanding their control.
Exactly. To understand their hatred of the Prussian option, you have to understand who ruled Prussia. It wasn't just a king. The entire state machinery, the military, and the bureaucracy were controlled by the Junkers.
Right. For those who might not know, who exactly are the Junkers?
So the Junkers were the deeply conservative, militaristic, land-owning aristocracy of East Albion Prussia. They lived on massive feudal estates, they dominated the officer corps of the Prussian army, and they despised democracy, constitutions, and anything that threatened their traditional privileges. Marx and Engels saw the Prussian Junkers as the ultimate final boss of German feudalism.
The final boss, yeah.
Yeah. They argued in the NRZ that Germany must become one state not only in word but in deed. And to bring this about, they said it was necessary above all that there should be neither an Austria nor a Prussia. They wanted the existing absolutist states to be completely shattered by a revolutionary onslaught of the people, paving the way for a truly new republic.
Okay, so that's the battle over unification. Then there is the agrarian question, which we touched on with the demands. The NRZ was publishing articles analyzing things like Petau's redemption memorandum. Petau was a Prussian minister who proposed a plan for dealing with peasant unrest. What was his plan, and why did the NRZ attack it?
Basically, Petau's memorandum proposed that some minor feudal dues would be abolished, but the vast majority of the heavy obligations, the ones that actually generated wealth for the landlords, would have to be bought out by the peasants through massive redemption payments. It was a compromise designed to protect the property rights of the nobility while offering a tiny concession to the peasants.
And the liberal bourgeoisie, the merchants and factory owners who were supposed to be leading this democratic revolution, they supported Petau's compromise, didn't they?
Yes, they did. And this is a crucial mechanism of Marxist theory playing out in real time. Marx and Engels recognized that the bourgeoisie needed the peasants. The peasants were the numerical majority. They were the natural allies of the bourgeoisie in the fight to overthrow the feudal lords.
Oh.
But in the pages of the NRZ, Wilhelm Wolff and Marx loudly denounced the Prussian liberal bourgeoisie for betraying those very peasants.
Wait, play devil's advocate for me here. If the wealthy liberal merchants need the peasants to help them overthrow the king and the Junkers, why would they betray their own allies? That seems strategically foolish.
Because of class anxiety. The liberal bourgeoisie looked at what was happening with the radical workers in Paris, and they looked at the angry peasants burning manor houses in the German countryside, and they got terrified. They realized that if they supported the peasants in abolishing feudal property without compensation, it would establish a legal precedent that property could simply be confiscated by the masses. And if feudal property could be confiscated today, what was to stop the workers from confiscating capitalist factories tomorrow?
Ah, so the fear of losing their own property overrides their desire for a democratic revolution. They realize they actually have more in common with the wealthy aristocratic lords than they do with the poor radicalized farmers.
Exactly. The bourgeoisie chose to compromise with the nobility, to share power with the king, rather than fully empower the working classes and the peasantry. The NRZ exposed this betrayal continuously, trying to show the peasants that the liberal politicians in Berlin were not their friends.
So we have domestic battles over unification and the peasantry. But if you read the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, they devoted massive amounts of ink to foreign policy. They are writing about the Schleswig-Holstein conflict, the Krakow Revolution in Poland, the uprisings in Milan, Italy. Why does a German democratic newspaper care so much about what is happening in neighboring countries?
Because Marx and Engels understood that revolution in the 19th century was fundamentally international. If we connect this to their broader geopolitical strategy, they firmly believed that a revolutionized Germany had to completely renounce its oppressive past regarding other nations. Germany could not be free if it continued to act as an oppressor.
Give me a specific example of this. How did they apply this to, say, Poland?
Well, Poland had been partitioned and wiped off the map by Russia, Prussia, and Austria in the late 18th century. In 1846, there had been an uprising in the Free City of Krakow, pushing for Polish national liberation, which was brutally crushed. In the NRZ, Marx and Engels passionately argued that the German democratic movement must support the restoration of an independent Poland.
Why exactly?
Because as long as Prussia occupied parts of Poland, the Prussian military remained strong, and the German people remained tied to the reactionary policies of their rulers. Supporting Polish liberation was a way to weaken the Prussian Junkers.
It's the idea that an oppressor nation forges its own chains. If the German working class supports their king in oppressing the Poles, they are just giving the king the military power he needs to oppress the German workers tomorrow.
Exactly. They applied this same logic to Italy, supporting the Italians in Milan who were fighting against Austrian imperial rule. They even supported the national liberation movement in the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein against the Danish monarchy because they saw it as part of the struggle to pry German-speaking lands away from foreign monarchies and integrate them into a united democratic Germany.
But overshadowing all of these local conflicts was one massive existential threat to the entire European Revolution, and that was Russia.
Yes, they viewed Russian Tsarism, specifically under Tsar Nicholas I, as the principal gendarme, the main policeman of Europe. Russia had a massive, highly disciplined, fiercely conservative army. Marx and Engels saw Tsarist Russia, along with oligarchical Britain, as the ultimate counter-revolutionary forces. They knew that if the revolutions in Germany, Hungary, or Italy got too successful, the local kings would simply call in the Russian army to crush them.
Right.
Therefore, the NRZ constantly advocated for a revolutionary war against Russia, believing it was the only way to safeguard the democratic gains in Europe and definitively break the power of the Prussian and Austrian monarchs who relied on Russian backing.
This is a staggering amount of geopolitical analysis for a daily paper. But I want to bring it back to the domestic politics, because there is something in the sources that feels almost contradictory. We've established that Marx and Engels wanted a unified, democratic Germany with universal suffrage. But during 1848, the German people actually elected national assemblies to do exactly that. You had the Frankfurt National Assembly, which was supposed to draft a constitution for all of Germany, and you had the Prussian Agreement Assembly in Berlin. Yet if you read the NRZ, Marx and Engels are relentlessly, savagely attacking these democratic bodies. Why? Weren't these assemblies the very thing they were fighting for?
This raises one of the most important questions in political theory, the distinction between the illusion of power and actual power. For Marx and Engels, establishing a parliamentary assembly wasn't enough. The fundamental question was always, who holds the physical monopoly on violence? Who controls the state machinery?
And who did control it?
The old monarchs. The king still controlled the army, the police, and the bureaucracy. Marx criticized these newly elected assemblies relentlessly because bodies like the Frankfurt Assembly were acting as if they were sovereign, while in reality they were just debating societies. They were drafting beautiful, eloquent constitutions, arguing over the phrasing of human rights, but they had absolutely no mechanism to enforce their laws.
Right. If the Frankfurt Assembly passes a law saying freedom of the press is guaranteed, but the Prussian king controls the soldiers with the bayonets who actually shut down the printing presses, the law is just a piece of paper.
Exactly. And the situation with the Prussian Assembly in Berlin was even worse. The liberal leaders of that assembly, men like Ludolf Camphausen and David Hansmann, who were wealthy bourgeois politicians, adopted the formula of creating a constitution by agreement with the crown. They were terrified of the radical crowds in the streets, so they sought to compromise with the Prussian king, Friedrich William IV.
And Marx and Engels branded them the agreeers, using it as a term of supreme insult.
Yes. By trying to compromise with the king, these assemblies completely rejected the principle of true popular sovereignty. They didn't claim power derived from the people. They begged for power to be shared by the monarch. Marx and Engels saw this as fatal. The assemblies were essentially a pressure valve. They gave the masses the appearance of a democratic revolution, keeping everyone distracted with parliamentary debates, while leaving the actual levers of state power safely in the hands of the old regime, giving the king time to regroup his forces.
Right.
The NRZ was pointing this out daily, screaming at the delegates that they were being played, and demanding that the assemblies act as a true dictatorship of the people to dismantle the old army and bureaucracy.
And this critical view of the compromising, toothless assemblies proved to be incredibly, tragically prophetic, because the old regimes did regroup. Which brings us to Section 5, Disenchantment and the Prussian Counter-Revolution. The optimism of the springtime of the peoples in March didn't last. By the time we get to the autumn and winter of 1848, the revolutionary wave across Europe is violently stalling. What was the turning point?
The turning point happened in France in June of 1848. The French provisional government, having secured its power, decided to shut down the national workshops, which were basically public works programs that provided relief and employment for the Parisian working class. In response, the desperate workers of Paris rose up in massive armed rebellion. For 4 days, June 23rd to the 26th, there was incredibly brutal street fighting.
The famous June days.
Yes, and the French bourgeois republic called in General Cavaignac and the regular army, and they crushed the workers' uprising with merciless artillery fire and mass executions. Thousands were killed.
And what was the ripple effect of that crushing defeat across the rest of Europe?
It was a massive signal. When the bourgeois republic in France showed it was willing to slaughter its own working class to maintain order, it gave the monarchist, aristocratic, and right-wing circles everywhere the courage to launch a general counterattack. The reactionaries in Prussia and Austria realized the momentum had shifted. The alliance between the liberal bourgeoisie and the working class was broken.
And we see the culmination of this right-wing counterattack in Marx's article from late 1848, titled The Prussian Counter-Revolution and the Prussian Judiciary. The source provides a truly chilling quote from Marx. He wrote, "The chief result of the revolutionary movement of 1848 is not what the peoples won, but what they lost, the loss of their illusions."
It's a profound statement on the psychological impact of a failed revolution. Marx noted that June, November, and December of 1848 were gigantic milestones on the path to the disenchantment and disintoxication of the minds of the European peoples.
Disintoxication, waking up from the hangover of the revolutionary spring. And one of the biggest illusions that Marx says was shattered was the superstitious faith in the judiciary.
This is a critical analysis of institutional power. People generally tend to believe that the justice system, the courts, are a neutral, independent arbiter of fairness. They believe the law sits above politics. But Marx points out that the prosaic north wind of the Prussian counter-revolution completely blighted this illusion. When the Prussian king decided to dissolve the Democratic Assembly and reassert absolute control, the courts did not defend the Constitution. They fell right in line with the king.
He specifically points to the actions of the Supreme Court of Berlin and the regional courts of appeal in places like Münster, Bromberg, and Ratibor. What exactly did these courts do during the counter-revolution?
They systematically purged the system. The courts simply dismissed or prosecuted any officials, judges, or prosecutors who had shown even mild revolutionary sympathies during the spring. Men like Esser, Waldeck, Temme, Kirchmann, and Gierke. These were men who believed they were acting legally under the new democratic norms. But the moment the political wind shifted, the courts turned on them.
Marx uses a very specific, evocative phrase here. He compares these Prussian courts to Turkish qadis and Chinese collegiums of mandarins. For the listener, a qadi is an Islamic judge, and in 19th century European political rhetoric, referring to someone as a qadi or a mandarin was shorthand for arbitrary, despotic rule, a bureaucrat who just enforces the whim of the emperor without any regard for objective law.
Exactly. The courts were revealed to be nothing but tools of the state machinery. They were just rubber stamping the decrees of the counter-revolutionary government without any qualms. The illusion of an independent judiciary was dead. Marx argued that the law is never neutral. It is simply the codified will of whoever holds the monopoly on force.
So as 1848 draws to a close, the assemblies are dissolved, the courts are purged, the armies are back in control, and the Neue Rheinische Zeitung itself is facing imminent suppression. What does this all mean for the broader theory Marx and Engels were developing? Like, what was the ultimate takeaway from this brutal continental defeat?
The ultimate realization, which really permeates the final writings of Volume 7, was a profound and bitter lesson regarding class dynamics. Marx and Engels concluded definitively that the liberal bourgeoisie could not be trusted to carry a democratic revolution through to the end. The moment the wealthy merchants and factory owners felt their own capitalist property and social dominance were threatened by the rising demands of the working class, they would abandon the revolution. They would willingly turn to counter-revolution and ally themselves with the old feudal powers, the kings, the junkers, the aristocrats, just to maintain order and protect their wealth.
They would rather live under a reactionary king who protects their factories from the workers than live in a true democracy that might empower the workers to demand better wages.
Precisely. And that realization permanently altered the strategic outlook of the international working class movement going forward. Marx concluded that the working class, the proletariat, had to develop its own independent political line and its own independent organizations. They could occasionally ally with the liberals for specific democratic gains, but they could never again trust the bourgeoisie to lead them because the bourgeoisie would inevitably betray the democratic cause when their property was on the line.
So, to summarize this incredible, chaotic journey we've taken today, we've watched Marx and Engels transition from abstract philosophers sitting in reading rooms into gritty, pragmatic operators during the explosions of 1848. We saw them fight against the naive military adventurism of the Paris emigrants, insisting instead on organic internal growth. We explored their highly specific, mechanical demands of the Communist Party in Germany, aiming for a single, indivisible republic, paid politicians, and the transformation of the military. We delved into their brilliant, exhausting media strategy with the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, using a daily newspaper to infiltrate the broader democratic movement, ruthlessly attacking the cowardice of their own allies while trying to steer a revolution in real time. And finally, we witnessed the harsh, sobering realities of the counter-revolution, where the illusions of neutral courts, sovereign debating assemblies, and a brave liberal bourgeoisie were violently shattered.
It was a crucible. The events of 1848 tested their theoretical rocket on the Launchpad, and while it ultimately exploded before reaching orbit, the failure forced them to refine the practical strategies they would advocate for the rest of their lives.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Why spend an hour dissecting 19th century German politics? Because the lesson of 1848 is about the absolute necessity of adapting theory to reality. It shows that political progress requires far more than just having good ideas or writing a logically sound treatise. It requires a deep, unsentimental understanding of class dynamics. It requires an awareness of the hidden mechanics of institutional power, recognizing that a constitution is just a piece of paper if you don't control the courts and the military that enforce it.
It's the difference between drawing a beautiful architectural blueprint of a house and actually trying to pour the concrete and build the walls while a hurricane is actively tearing the scaffolding down. You have to understand the materials you are working with and the forces working against you.
Exactly. And that brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with, something to mull over on your own. In 1848, Marx and Engels used the daily printed newspaper, which was the absolute cutting-edge mass communication technology of their time, as a weapon to cut through the noise, organize their scattered followers, and attempt to push a massive political movement to the left. If they were operating today, what would be the exact modern equivalent for that kind of radical democratic organizing? And in our era of endless scrolling, fragmented attention spans, and rigid algorithmic silos that only show you what you already agree with, would their strategy of infiltrating a broader democratic movement with radical ideas still work? Or would their message simply be drowned out in the feed, unable to reach the masses they desperately wanted to organize? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.